verbally. We did have a pre-recorded tax stamp overview that had been published out, I believe, last week, Carrie. And so that is also a resource that is available to you. And I can also make the presentation that was covered during that pre-recorded webinar available to any of the participants. Just shoot me a chat or a note, and I will put my email address in the chat right now so you have it. And so with that, we can open the floor.
Hey, Alex, this is Katie Boyle again. I just maybe to kick things off with sort of the question I posed before, just to kind of talk about process. So supposing a county decides to move forward with the new cigarette tax authority that takes effect July 1st. And so supposing that they reach out to SICPA, what would be the process? And then could you talk a little bit about the lead time that you all need? Because I think that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. So apologies because we tried to describe that before. So we have a standard intake form that we can provide to a jurisdiction, which guides us and the jurisdiction through the questions that we need to get answered around what type of tax stamp, time frame, et cetera. That is available from Lisa Edmonds, and I'll put her contact information in the chat as well. We have two different types of stamps that we make available. There's a generic stamp, which uses a common design, but can be personalized with an alphanumeric code for a specific jurisdiction. So you could use an abbreviation, a zip code, whatever form of identifier that you would make the generic stamp essentially personalized for the jurisdiction, so you could recognize it as your version of the generic stamp. We also have a custom stamp option, which is a unique visual design of the entire stamp specific to a jurisdiction. Both are available. Both are widely used by the current municipality, city, and township local stamping programs, typically dependent on the volume. Most of them use the generic stamp because they're very low volume, but some of the very high volume current local jurisdictions do use a custom stamp. In terms of time frame, we typically require between 45 and 60 days to produce a stamp from what we call artwork approval, which is the decision to use either a generic or custom stamp, and we work with you to then get what that looks like approved, and then from that point, it's roughly 45 to 60 days.
Alex, I just want to comment that my email address is lisa.edmonds@meyercord.com.
Okay, there is a question here in regards to timing required for the Board of Supervisors to make the decision. Is there a drop dead date? They would lose the option. So, again, it depends on what date you are looking to make the cigarette tax enforceable. So is it July 1? May it be a date after July 1? Again, we typically require 45 to 60 days. Again, we can work with individual jurisdictions depending on which type of stamp is selected. If there's a need to maybe expedite a little more quickly, but that should be the timeline that should be planned on for making tax stamps available once a cigarette excise tax is authorized by the Board of Supervisors. And I am, just to give you some additional context, we have had some instances where, and I know Jeff Smith was invited to the call, where a jurisdiction didn't have tax stamps in inventory and was, because they hadn't planned on ordering. This happened when we had the run up to the increase in taxes with the state. The wholesalers do work with jurisdictions at times to also file an affidavit of activity that can be used as an interim solution to cover the initial implementation of a tax if you're waiting on a tax stamp. And I would encourage a jurisdiction to certainly reach out to Jeff Smith with the Virginia wholesalers to discuss that as an option if you are waiting for a tax stamp to be produced and want to implement a tax before then. Question, what do we define as high volume? So that is variable. At the low end, our current customers at the city, municipality, and township level may order, 540,000 stamps, and that covers them for an entire year. That would be very low volume. We have some jurisdictions that are ordering 15 million or more stamps a year. That would be very high volume. So again, there's not a hard and fast rule about who requires a custom stamp versus using the generic stamp. We have some of our higher volume customers on the generic version of the stamp. It's more than appropriate for their needs. And we have some lower volume customers that have decided they wanted a custom stamp. Yep. How do you determine who places the stamps on the cartons? There was a suggestion in the webinar that low volume may do this themselves. So the wholesaler distributors are the ones who apply the cigarette excise stamps currently. They do so using two mechanisms. There is a high volume stamping machine that a wholesaler acquires directly from USI or Red Stamp. And that is designed to apply cartons, cigarette stamps to packs in a carton at a very high rate of speed, somewhere between 60 to 90 cartons per minute. However, not all packs of cigarettes conform to the width and depth of the openings that the machine requires. There are some products out there that don't have the same dimensions as, say, a pack of Marlboros do. In that case, the option is there for the stamper, the wholesaler distributor, to apply the stamp by hand. And so they do that using a heat iron to get the stamp to stick to the pack of cigarettes, doing that one at a time. The wholesalers typically receive a discount on the cost of the tax stamp from the jurisdiction to provide for them to be able to handle that process, to maintain and acquire the machinery, and for the personnel required to apply the stamps. And that is probably something you may wish to consider, and I would advise reaching out to Katie Carey or Jeff Smith in that regards on discounting programs that are currently used by Virginia jurisdictions. Next question, should you keep stamps on hand in your office? So the traditional mechanism that we have used with our customers is to deliver, stamps in bulk to the customer. So for example, today, the Virginia Department of Taxation receives pallets of tax stamps from us, which taxation then stores in their premises and then distributes themselves. And that is also the case with most of the cities, townships, and municipalities that we support. So the traditional way that you would order stamps from us is you would ask for a certain quantity of stamps. I believe we've determined the minimum quantity, Lisa, is going to be 5 or 10 rolls of stamps, which is about half a case. But you can certainly order more, and then they would be stored at a jurisdictional office or jurisdictional designated place, and the jurisdiction would then distribute those tax stamps to the wholesaler distributor stamping agents based on orders that come in. What we have proposed as an option is what we call our Direct-to-Distributor Service, which is being used by 15 states today, and we're having a conversation with the Department of Taxation to migrate to this service next fiscal year, where instead of you having to receive a large quantity of stamps, inventory those stamps, store those stamps, and then deal with getting those stamps to the wholesalers, we do those services for you. So we produce the stamps on your behalf, and then we store them at our facility and distribute orders as approved by the jurisdiction. With this service, you also don't have to ever worry about running out of tax stamps, which has occurred in some of our customers in Virginia, where they have not placed an order in a timely manner, or quite frankly, forgotten to place an order and have found themselves short of tax stamps for a period of time. With D2D, we monitor the inventories for you, and we will always maintain a stock of stamps available to be distributed to the stamping agents upon your approval. The D2D service has several different shipping options. It allows the wholesaler to decide the class of service they receive the stamps in via FedEx or UPS. And so we would work with the jurisdiction to provide different options that could be offered to the wholesaler, standard 2-day shipping, a next day service, depending on the need they have for tax stamps. And there's a question here on the cost for Meyercord to do this, and where is the revenue flow? So the revenue flow doesn't change. D2D is the fulfillment service. Payments would continue to be made directly to the jurisdiction. We don't get involved in the payments for the tax stamps. Once the payment had been received, or upon some other jurisdictional approval, we are then notified to ship the appropriate quantity of tax stamps to that wholesaler distributor location. We do track tax stamps using what we call roll IDs. So each roll of stamps that we produce has a unique ID associated to it. That's for our inventory purposes when we're producing the stamps. It's also for your inventory purposes when we either ship stamps directly to the wholesaler or we're shipping the stamps for you to be doing the distribution out of one of your offices. So it's a control mechanism we put in place that we know each roll of stamps that has gone to a specific jurisdiction. Those rolls can also be used to track which stamps are going to a specific wholesaler. So with D2D, you do have full visibility and control into what happened to each roll of stamps, who it was distributed to, so you can marry that up with any payments that you are receiving. In terms of the cost of the program, the cost is in addition to the base cost of the stamp. So I'm not going to get into costs in a public forum. We'd be happy to have a direct conversation with each jurisdiction. In general, our costing is based on the volume of stamps that you order. We achieve efficiency through volume, and we pass that efficiency on to our customers in terms of tiering our pricing based on the volume of stamps produced. So there's a question now on, so stamping happens at the wholesaler only. That is the most typical way. The wholesalers are the stamping agents that apply the tax stamps for the vast majority of jurisdictions. We have had a few one-offs where there's been a retailer application of the tax stamp. However, that is not an efficient mechanism for getting tax stamps to be applied. By applying the tax stamp at the wholesaler level, you're getting visibility into the distribution of products into the retailers in your jurisdiction from an entity that is not in necessarily your jurisdiction. And so that gives you the ability to have a reconciliation of what has happened. The general thought process on cigarette tax stamping is the person who is selling the product should not be stamping the product. It's the person who's paying the tax on the product who should be applying the tax stamp, which is typically the wholesaler distributor. So I hope that answered the questions I'm seeing up to this point in the chat.
Alex, could I throw one other question your way? So I think our members are aware there's been a lot of conversations, and we've been talking and hearing from counties that are thinking a lot about a regional solution to implementation, and I think that there's a lot of interest out there. There's some pretty serious conversations happening among some regional bodies, whether under the auspices of the Planning District Commission or perhaps setting up some other regional entity. So could you talk a little bit about how you work with the Northern Virginia board, how that could be potentially replicated in other regional bodies versus how you work with individual jurisdictions?
Yes, certainly. So the NVCTB actually acquires tax stamps through an agreement under the state contract. So the NVCTB and Department of Taxation have a joint cigarette tax stamp that covers both. So rather than having a wholesaler distributor have to apply a state stamp to a product and then apply a second NVCTB stamp to a product, there's one stamp that serves for both. And that is actually acquired through the Department of Taxation under the taxation contract through the agreement that NVCTB has with taxation. And so there's one uniform stamp that is used for all the participating jurisdictions of the NVCTB. So I believe right now there are 19, although Deb Cannon, if she's on the call, could probably give me a more accurate number. All those jurisdictions essentially share the same stamp, and NVCTB then has a set of processes that they use to reconcile which volume of products have gone into which jurisdiction to make sure that the taxes are appropriately distributed to the different members of the NVCTB. So for those jurisdictions that are considering a similar type of board structure, I believe the SB 588 actually has an authorization for those stamps to be potentially acquired through the Department of Taxation contract vehicle and directs taxation to do so if requested. So what I would recommend is if you're considering a board to engage in a discussion with the Department of Taxation about the feasibility of either a joint stamp or following at least the NBCT path of doing the acquisition of the stamps through the state contract vehicle. Now, I think the one thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about tax stamps, right, this is not the only piece of a cigarette excise tax administrative and compliance program. As we talked about a little bit on the webinar, there are a couple of things that are also as important, right? The ability to know who your taxpayer is, which retailers are authorized to be distributing and selling the product in your jurisdiction. This has been a big challenge, I believe, for wholesalers in the past. There can be challenges in identifying, the geocode location of a retailer and whether or not it sits within one jurisdiction's boundary or another, because that's not always obvious from the address. I know that NBCTB has a process in place through which they work through manual processes and other outreach to make sure that they've effectively identified the retail location for each cigarette seller so that they can appropriately distribute the tax based on the number of packs a wholesaler has sent to retailer A versus retailer B, which could be in two different jurisdictions. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of any local program, making sure you've got a firm identification on those retailers who are selling your products so you know who is receiving them and how much tax should be coming in. There's also the element of being able to ingest the data. You're going to need to reconcile the tax receipts that you have. So stamps are a mechanism by which you can collect the tax, but you're going to want reporting to come in that's going to, from the stamping agent saying, here's what I declared that I did. This matches up to the number of stamps that I used. That gives you the ability to reconcile against different data points to make sure you're collecting everything that should be collected. The final piece would be your enforcement and compliance efforts. I believe there is model legislation that has been introduced or model statutes that the wholesalers have worked on in terms of what a de minimis standard for a stamp is. And what I mean by de minimis standard is, a heat transfer tax stamp is not going to apply 100% all the time. The application of the tax stamp itself is a relatively violent process. It's using pressure, time, and heat to make sure that the tax stamp is affixed to the polypropylene on the outside of a cigarette pack. And so, there can be damage to a stamp, and that is normal and accepted. That a stamp will have some degree of impairment when it's applied to the cigarette pack. And so when we talk about de minimis standards, we're talking about how much impairment is acceptable for the stamp application to be considered valid by a jurisdiction when you're looking at that tax stamp at a retail location. And so, making sure that we have standards for consistent de minimis requirements, is an important element of tax stamping, so that everyone knows what they're supposed to be looking for when you're observing tax stamps in the field on packs at a retail location. And similar to that, de minimis standards lead to things like seizures and how you're going to then take product if you determine it is not valid stamped. What are you going to do to store that material that you seized so it's not impaired during storage, and you work through the process with the taxpayers about whether or not the tax has been appropriately paid and whether these products should then continue to be offered for sale or need to be re-stamped. So these are just some considerations to think through as you're looking at a cigarette excise program.
Alex, your recorded webinar was so well organized and full of such important information, and your follow-up today, again, same very well organized format. I'm not surprised that we don't have that many questions for you, actually, but I do think that questions will come up over time, and we will make sure that all of you know how to reach out to Alex and his team. In the meantime, VACo is creating what we call a cigarette tax toolkit that we will be posting on our website that will include the recorded webinar as well as today's live question and answer session. And so you can access that information as you need it. We would really like to thank Alex and the SICPA-Meyercord Revenue team for all of your assistance in this issue, and thank Katie for her follow-up information in today's session. And thanks again to you all for joining us again for our recap session. We will be available to you for any questions that you may have, and we are happy to direct you in the right direction as those questions come up. So have a wonderful day today, and please stay
And
safe
Gary?
and well. Yes, Alex.
I just might interject. I just put in the chat, we've also published a website, mytaxstamp.com, that has further information on tax stamps. There's also a link there to make an inquiry. So at the top of the website, there's actually a link. You can make a stamp inquiry. It'll open up an email that'll go directly to us, myself, Lisa, and others, if you have questions about tax stamps. And you can also request pricing. Again, it'll kick out an email to us, and we can then interact with you on the tax stamp process. So, please feel free to use that resource. But again, I also put my email in the chat. Lisa put her email in the chat. We are here to be a resource. Reach out to us at any time. We're happy to be engaged with you.
And with that, we will conclude today's session. Thank you so much for your time today. And as we said, we are here for you if you need us. Thank you and have a wonderful day.